Namaskar and good evening, everybody. At first, I would like to welcome all the participants to this Sunday webinar hosted by Philosophy Family. Well, we have with us Dr. Prasant Sukla, sir. I think he needs no introduction because he has already delivered 5 to 6 talks, very good talks in Philosophy Family, and the talks are also uploaded in the YouTube. So I don't think it's necessary for introducing Dr. Sukla. We know about Dr. Sukla. Most of his talks were on Greek philosophy, and today he has come up with a new title. He will be speaking on logical criticism versus literary criticism, the task of a philosopher. Well, during the course of the last lecture, I remember he was discussing on the role of a philosopher, what is philosophy, and all that. And most of the references that he takes are from Greek philosophy. I think he's an expert in that area. So we are very privileged and fortunate to have him, to listen to him. Without wasting much time, I request Dr. Sukla to address his talk. But before that, I welcome all the senior faculty members who have joined, including Dr. Alok Tindon, sir, and our host, Professor Pramod Kumar Das, Senior Professor Professor Ranjit Ghosh, sir, and among others who have joined. Even I see a lot of faces. I welcome all of them to this webinar. I think, like the earlier ones, today too we'll be having a very nice discussion on the deliberation of Dr. Sukla. So with these words, let us all move to Dr. Sukla for the lecture. Over to Professor Sukla. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words. I'm so much full of appreciation for Philosophy Family for doing such a nice task in the field of philosophy, getting the people, seeking attention, pushing people towards the field of philosophy, giving them a brief outline of what we people are doing in the field of philosophy. It's so interesting that a lot of people keep on talking about philosophy as a discipline as well as a way of life. But as academic philosophers, we find that people are having a very vague kind of idea about what we do in the field of philosophy. And sometimes we get some surprising as well as shocking remarks from the people about the discipline of philosophy. There are people who might say that since we have gone through the religious text, that is why we know what philosophy is about. Then there are some impressions where people think that if we are philosopher, we must be talking about the notions like the Brahma, the Moksha, or the Maya. Then there are some other fields where the people claim that the philosophers might be searching for a black cat in a dark room. So, in a sarcastic sense, of course. I believe that it is the prima facie task of a philosopher to just refine our understanding about the discipline of philosophy. What do we mean by the term philosophy? What pertains to the discipline of philosophy? And what does a philosopher actually do? Now, in our previous discussion, which happened a couple of months before, we talked about the task of a philosopher, and then we realized, how can we talk about the task of a philosopher unless and until we know the distinction between the kind of criticism a philosopher is doing or giving as compared to the kind of criticism the people from other disciplines are giving. I believe this would give us a fair enough idea of what the discipline of philosophy is talking about. I'm really thankful to the Philosophy Family, to Rao sir, to Das sir, to Ghosh sir, and all the people here for providing me such an esteemed platform with such well-versed gentry here, and I consider it as a privilege for me. Now, as we have discussed a couple of months before as well, I was always at a sort of unease a sort of discomfort while talking about philosophy as love of knowledge or the quest for wisdom. Well, at no point of time I'm claiming that this definition is incorrect. What I simply feel is that this definition becomes like an overarching term, a sort of umbrella term which includes too many things within it. Some of them are of philosophical nature, whereas others are not. Maybe this is the reason that once we start talking about philosophy, we slip into the unknown horizons, which have philosophical traces, of course, because everything under the same sun is bound to have some sort of philosophical inclination, but they are not philosophical in the technical sense of the term. If that is so, at the very first step, we are supposed to clarify the distinction between what is philosophy and what is not philosophy. Of course, the experts of every discipline try to provide some kind of criticism, try to refine our knowledge. And if it is so, how come a philosophical criticism, what we call as the logical criticism, is different from that of the criticism provided by other disciplines? Here I'm focusing on the criticism as provided in literature. So that is the primary task which I want to serve in this particular discussion. I just hope that it will be useful for the audience and it will generate a lot of questions which I would be happy to take. Now, I would ask permission to share my window for sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I hope it is visible to everyone. So the discussion of today will be focusing on logical criticism versus literary criticism, which is precisely the task of a philosopher. Now, I would like to start with a ridiculous sort of slide, but I'm sure it would generate some questions in the mind of the audience. So before starting any further, let me ask you a question. While looking at the slide, my question is, what is this? Now, many of you might be smiling or maybe a little bit confused that why this question? And if you think, your obvious response, of course, would be, well, this is a mouse. And of course, some people might call it a rat or a hamster or whatever it is, but the sense is the same. And once you responded to the question by saying that, quote unquote, this is a mouse, immediately another question might arise in your mind. What sort of question is this? Is it not too kiddish? Is it not ridiculous? But then I would say, just hold for a moment. This is a strategic question. And since we are asking it in a discussion of philosophy, the answer would not be so obvious as it seems to be. This is a strategic question. Well, after asking this question, I will not prolong it further. I will just hold on to the response. I will come back to this question later, maybe by the end of the discussion, and we will see whether we are able to change our response, whether we would like to refine our response, or maybe we would carry on with our simple response that, quote unquote, this is a mouse. So this is something we are supposed to keep in our mind before starting our discussion now. So the first question which is asked is usually, what is a philosophical activity? What is the purpose of a philosophical activity? Well, a definitional account of what it means to be a philosopher and hence to engage in philosophical activity is our concern today. What constitutes a specifically philosophical method might emerge as a method perhaps distinct from that found in any other discipline or any other activity. There are various ways of dividing up philosophical positions, traditions, viewpoints, criticisms, depending on their respective methodologies, approach, or concerns over the content. That is why we believe that one might be an analytical philosopher like Frege or Russell, or a phenomenologist like Husserl, Heidegger, Brentano, or an existentialist like Soren Kierkegaard, Sartre, or Simone de Beauvoir. One might be a Thomist by becoming a follower of Thomas Aquinas, or maybe a Platonist or an Aristotelian, or maybe some reconstituted version of any one of the three. Along with this, anyone could conceivably still be a Cartesian modernist, maybe a Hegelian idealist, Derridian deconstructionist, or Lyotardian postmodernist. Even more specifically, one could be a Kantian epistemologist, a Wittgensteinian linguist, a meta-atheist, or a utilitarian, or an emotivist, or an institutionalist, and so on and so forth. In fact, the list of possibilities is almost endless. And along with this, as W.T. Space says in his book, A Critical History of Greek Philosophy, there would be a philosopher who would be a follower of Herbert Spencer and therefore would like to negate Hegelian idealism. And then there would be a Hegelian idealist who try to refute the Spencerian view of philosophy. So what is exactly the philosophical activity? We have seen that the definition and the task of philosophy has changed from region to region, from place to place, and from time to time. The naturalist or the cosmogonist definition of philosophy, as was presumed by the later Greek philosophers, might not work for the later Greek philosophers like the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Marcus Aurelius, or so on. The definition of philosophy, as was accepted by the medieval age thinkers like Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Aquinas, Anselm, or Augustine, might not be acceptable to Bacon and Descartes. And then the definition as was given by continentals would not be acceptable by the analytics, and vice versa. And this is precisely the reason that we are confused that what is exactly a philosophical activity. Are there technical philosophers or are there public philosophers? Does it mean that only technical people can do philosophy, or the layman can also do philosophy? That is to be seen, and that is the purpose of today's discussion. So what is or what should be the concern of a philosopher? Broadly speaking, all these possibilities are largely distinguished, arguably, from each other geographically as well as methodologically and conceptually. And on this background, in the present times, we talk about two diverse, quite opposite traditions of philosophy. We call them as either the Anglo-American analytic tradition, followed by the people like Frege, Russell, Strawson, Quine, Peirce, Wittgenstein, Moore, and so on. Or on the other side, the continental phenomenological tradition, which includes, of course, the phenomenologists, the existentialists, the feminists, the environmental ethics, and so on and so forth. Now, this account, of course, constitutes a massively and therefore crudely compressed version of the two opposite traditions. The intention here is not to sketch the entirety of the traditions. My purpose here is merely to point to some of the more obvious problems when a single or uniform definition of the philosophical activity is being attempted. Who is doing a philosophy? The analyticals or the phenomenologists? Well, we are not sure. And let's try to develop a clearer understanding of what is exactly the philosophical activity. And in due course of time, we will like to distinguish between the literary criticism and the logical criticism and the first order inquiry versus the second order inquiry. Now, let us first of all come to the analytic tradition. Since Frege, Russell, Moore, Strawson, the early Wittgenstein, and the Vienna School, now all these have been preoccupied with the place and significance of the logical form and logical expressions in relation to the nature and the scope of human knowledge. Obviously, most of them were the realist thinkers as opposed to the idealist tendency of the continental tradition. Well, it's like a generalization. There might be exceptions, of course. So as a consequence, the systematic translation of formal arguments into symbolic logic has often taken precedence over the use of everyday language to express a view about the world and its complex operations. Overall speaking, the analytic tradition owes its allegiance to the empirical sciences, of course, like physics, because at the early times, physics meant science. Of course, I'm talking about times of Bacon and all. So these analytical traditions owe their allegiance to the empirical sciences and mathematics, both in terms of its aims and methods. Believing that sciences and mathematics are the paradigmatic disciplines insofar as a serious pursuit of truth is concerned. And so goes with philosophy. So there is a close connection between these sciences, mathematics, and philosophy. In fact, there are analytical traditions who would say that the closest discipline to the field of philosophy would be none other than mathematics. And we will discuss the reason why they say so. But anyway, right now, we are going to have a broad outline of the continental tradition. So this continental tradition is arguably a little more diverse in its growth and development. In its essence, the tradition began, historically speaking, with Immanuel Kant, whose philosophical concerns were also principally epistemological in nature. How can we attain, how can we acquire knowledge in its pure form, that is, objective and universal form? For Immanuel Kant, the knowledge we as subjects have of the world as an external object is knowledge of how the world appears to us. Now the word appears to us becomes crucial here, and that is why we can only ever fully experience and know the world and its content as phenomena, but not as noumena. However, the formally recognized school of phenomenology is generally traced back to none other than Edmund Husserl, for whom philosophy, at least in the 20th century, had all but lost its way. It deviated from its purpose. But then the question comes, what was exactly the purpose of philosophy? Hence, Edmund Husserl sought to ground it in a proper investigation of the world as it appears to us without reference to a world behind or beyond the one we inhabit. They call it transcendental, mystic, or whatever. So the existential and the linguistic concerns of the phenomenological movement involve a deeply complex configuration of German idealism, romanticism, and French social and political critique. Well, we all know about the notions like Geist, the absolute spirit, and then the bad faith, po soi, en soi, and so on. So these are the content of the continental traditions, at least in the very beginning. Now the question in front of us is how to distinguish the nature of the discipline, what we call as philosophy. So these two broad characterizations, what we call as analytic tradition and the continental tradition, help to distinguish the current competitive nature of the discipline. On one hand, there is analytic extremity concerning one's method is exclusively to do with the reduction of all human conduct, all human understanding to the precise formula of symbolic logic. So they are focusing more on the form or the syntactical structure of our knowledge. Now, on the other hand, as we see, whilst at the extremity of the continental tradition, one's method is to do with the poetic celebration of human differences in a mystical, metaphoric, or disjunctional manner. Well, I cannot find any other word apart from calling it the poetic celebration. And that is the word which has come to us time and again once we talk about the approach and the inclination of the continental philosophers. So while the continental tradition celebrates the diversity, the analytic tradition is one which tries to focus on unity, unanimity, and uniformity. And that is why these two traditions go diagonally opposite to each other. So what do we do? How can we decipher the exact nature of the philosophical activity? Considering how we fashion a method for exploring the issues or questions that concern us, these competing, conflicting, and complementary traditions exist on a much higher level of generality that one might initially suppose. So as my supervisor, Professor R.P. Singh used to say in my JNU days, philosophy means going from the concrete to the abstract, whereas the other disciplines like sociology, economics, and so on, they try to take the abstract to the level of concrete. Well, that was a marvelous definition and as simple as it gets. And this is not something new. This higher level of generality, which is the hallmark of philosophy, has been discussed by a lot many thinkers. I would prefer to take the definition as is given by Wilfrid Sellars. Now, Sellars clarifies this higher level of generality by saying that, quote unquote, philosophy is concerned with how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. I repeat, Sellars has used the portion broadest possible sense of the term twice, and in both the attempts, the different kind of interpretation comes out. So as we discuss in class time and again, we are not going to talk about this particular cup. I cannot talk about the color, the shape, the weight, the size, the format of this cup. Why? Because talking about this particular individual or particular cup in a particular space or time is the task of a science person. Maybe you can analyze it from the perspective of a sociologist or even economics and so on. Well, some of the psychiatrists might also take out a psychological dimension of it. But up to the time I'm talking about this particular cup, I'm not doing philosophy. I will try to do philosophy once I take out a general idea by observing a lot many cups or maybe mugs. And that is how I arrive at a general notion of cup, what we prefer to call as cupness. And that is why we find in Indian philosophy that the notions we take is either you talk about Nyaya, Sankhya, Mimamsa, or Vedanta. We talk not about cow, but the cowness, that is Gotva. We don't talk about a particular person, but humanity or humanness, that is Manushyatva. We don't talk about a pot, but we talk about potness, that is Ghatatva, and so on. So whether you talk about the Oriental or the Occidental tradition, all philosophers are trying to reach the higher level of generality. They are trying to do a sort of conceptual analysis. I also remember the prominent definition of Russell where he says philosophy is nothing else but the conceptual analysis of the term. Two terms are crucial here. He is not going towards the perceptual analysis, but only and only the conceptual analysis. And he is not going to do the analysis of the word. He is going to do the analysis of a term, where we have to remember a term is a symbol, a logo, a sign representing a complete class of individual members, objects, or entities. The definition still remains the same. Higher level of generality, or as Sellers says, things in the broadest possible sense of term, hanging together in the broadest possible sense of the term. And if it is true, if you agree with this, I would not be hesitant to give a standard definition of philosophy by saying that philosophy aims at an overall picture of what the world is like and how we fit into it. So while other disciplines are going to develop an ant's view, it is only a philosopher which tries to develop a bird's eye view. Well, this kind of definition is sometimes criticized, of course, where the people say that the philosopher tries to act like a person standing on an ivory tower and looking down about the world. Is it so? I don't think so. A philosopher is only trying to churn out something general by observing the particulars. As I said, observing the concrete, but deducing out the universal or the general. That is why a philosopher is supposed to conceptually theoretize, not to do empirical observation. Is empirical observation not important? Of course it is. How can you generalize unless and until there are particular individual observations? But then it is not the task of a philosopher. Let it be done by other disciplines which are equally important and complementary to philosophy, but then they are non-philosophical disciplines. There is a reason why there is distinction between the philosophical inclinations and non-philosophical inclinations. So what we do is that we try to go to the higher level of generality, we try to create definitions, we try to generate formula, just like mathematics. So I remember that the distinctiveness of philosophy has been indicated not by philosophers, but by other disciplines as well. Now, we all have the basic knowledge of sociology, and there are people who confuse philosophy with that of sociology and try to put inside the issue of sociology or social work or political science or activism within the domain of philosophy, which is something improper and inappropriate. Remember the time when we were reading Aristotle's Metaphysics, and Aristotle was trying to create a hierarchy in the world. If you remember, there was hierarchy where philosophy was kept at the top. This is the obsession for attaining the most general type of knowledge, which can be easily observed in the works of Aristotle when he maintains a hierarchy of the world. And you can refer to metaphysics here. But then remember, once we start reading the father of sociology, Auguste Comte, and Comte tries to create a pyramid of the different disciplines, it is interesting to see that for Auguste Comte, this pyramid becomes upside down, as you can see on the slide. So, Comte keeps sociology at the top, biology immediately below sociology, and then, of course, going down, chemistry, physics, astronomy, and mathematics at the bottom. And then Auguste Comte gives us a kind of rationalization for this kind of pyramid by saying that sociology is a specific discipline where each case is unique. Therefore, you cannot apply a general theory unconditionally on a particular case study because it pertains a distinct kind of flavor. Of course, biology is so close to sociology because each living body is distinct, is unique. So while disciplines like sociology try to focus on the particularity, the uniqueness of every individual, every case study, philosophy and mathematics act quite contrary to this. They try to consider this generality or universality as a kind of hallmark of philosophical discussion. So they try to create some such formula which can be applicable to all the places, at all the times, and in all the contexts. That is why it is so interesting to see that the pyramids was given by different thinkers in different disciplines, but the kind of pyramid or hierarchy given by philosophers is just opposite to that given by other thinkers. It must be remembered that generality is the unique feature of philosophy along with mathematics. I mean, I cannot remember any other discipline which can come closer to philosophical nature other than the discipline of philosophy, where we talk about a lot of theorems, formulas, symbols, signs, none of which them are observable in their particular form in the world. If you want to learn them, you can come only in the general format. And that is the task of mathematics and that of philosophy. Now, if such is the case, then the question arises, how can we differentiate between literary and logical criticism? Now, here I'm trying to take a quotation from Introduction to Logical Theory as given by P.F. Strawson. So Strawson knew that this problem is bound to come to the students of philosophy, and that is why this is the problem which comes on the very first page of his book, Logical Theory. And actually Strawson starts with this question, a very viable kind of question. What is the kind of distinction between the criticism given by a logical and philosophical person and the criticism posed by a literature? Strawson says, when a man says or writes something, there are so many different ways in which his performance may be judged. Among other things, we may question his truthfulness or criticize his style. We may assess the morality of what he says, or we may appreciate its logic. Though not all these types of assessment are appropriate to all kind of utterances. For example, if a student studies Plato's Republic in a literature class and then in a philosophy class, is there supposed to be a difference, a distinction in the way the text is encountered or not? Once we study Republic in the philosophy class, can it be the same thing as we discuss Republic in English literature class? If yes, if both cannot be the same, then we have to admit that literary criticism and logical criticism are distinct methodologies leading to different kind of appraisals. So here the word logical and illogical are crucial here, and these are themselves among the words of logical and philosophical appraisal. If you call a discourse logical, you are in some degree commending it. I'm talking about only the discourse, not the object they are pointing to. So if you call a discourse as logical, you are in some degree commending it. And if you call it illogical, you are so far condemning it, ignoring it, avoiding it. Now, the words and the phrases which go with the logical are maybe consistent, cogent, valid, or it follows that. And word and phrases which go with illogical are inconsistent, self-contradictory, invalid, non sequitur, and so on. Now, part of our problem is to see what sort of appraisal these words are used for, to what kind of standards we appeal in using them. It is easy to see that these are not moral or aesthetic standards. No, morality and aesthetic has got nothing to do with the logical appraisal. That logical criticism is not, say, a kind of literary criticism. So once we talk about plate in the literature class, we might appreciate a language, we might appreciate the way in which it describes the word and the nature of the people involved, of course. But a philosopher tries to find a consistency between the arguments which are presented in that particular text. Whether they are relevant for the external world or not, that is not the task of a philosopher. A philosopher is trying to find a consistency latent in the arguments as may be given in a text like Plato's Republic. And that is how a logical criticism is bound to be different from the literary criticism, the social criticism, or whatever it is. A slight more difficult distinction is that between the criticism we offer when we declare a man's remark to be untrue and the criticism we offer when we declare that the criticism, the argument is inconsistent. There is a hell lot of distinction between these two kind of criticisms. Now, in the first place, we criticize his remark on the ground that they fail to square with the facts. And by fact, I mean the brute facts as found in the external world, as can be achieved by our empirical senses. But in the second case, that is the logical criticism, we criticize them on the ground that they fail to square with one another. So there is difference. There is such apparent, obvious difference between the two. The charge of untruth refers beyond the word and sentences the man uses to that in the word about which he tasks. We deny his assertion, and in doing so, we make a counter assertion of our own about the object of his discourse. We contradict him, but the charge of inconsistency does not in this way refer to anything outside the statement that the man makes. We simply consider the way his statement hang together. Now, I just remember the Shastrarth Parampara in India, where we have got an impression as if the Bodh and the Nyayikas were sitting face to face and were having Shastrarth or a dialogue with each other. Was that the case? Well, it was never the case. In fact, the condition was like this: a Nyayika would never like to go to the Buddhist ashram and vice versa. So how the dialogue was taking place? Well, a Nyayika would take the Buddhist position as given in the text, analyze it, and hypothesize a counter argument, and then it will be sent to the Buddhist camp. Then the Buddhist philosophers would read the argument, try to create a counter argument, and send it back to the Nyayikas. So The argument and the counter argument tradition known as dialogue was taking place by focusing on the consistency of the statement, the consistency of the argument, not the consistency of the fact. Nobody was talking about the fact as is available in the external world, but they were talking about the internal, the intrinsic consistency of the argument, and that is precisely the task of logical criticism. That is how we do philosophy. So we can differentiate between logical and literary criticism as the distinction between the intrinsic as well as the extrinsic criticism. While the logical criticism focuses on the consistency and inconsistency, the extrinsic argument or the literary argument considers the objects or the facts as they appear in the external world. So there is obvious distinction between these two different kind of criticisms. Now, just from considering the sentences themselves as they are used, we can perhaps see that not all the statement he makes can be true together. It is not that we contradict him and in doing so make a counter assertion about the subject of his remark. And in doing this, we make no appeal to the facts and express no opinion about the facts. We share about our opinion or our position about the statements or the arguments which are posited in front of us. It is this precise method of internal criticism that is the appraisal of the logic of a piece of philosophical discourse. And that should be the concern of a philosopher. And with this, all this background, I'm coming to the first order and the second order inquiry. Now, most of the statements we make are not themselves about the statements, but about people or about things. Isn't it the case? Statements which are not themselves about the statements, we shall call the first order statements. So once I say this is a cup, looking at the cup, and you identify my statement as true or false, you are making a first order inquiry. But when I am analyzing the statement, quote unquote, this is a cup, I'm doing a second order inquiry because I'm not focusing on the object called cup, but I'm talking about the general notion or concept of cupness, which is the focus or which should be the focus of a philosopher. So statements which are not themselves about the statements, we shall call first order statement, and the statements about first order statements we shall call second order statements, and so on. Now I remember the prominent, most important criticism which has come to me time and again once I start teaching Heraclitus philosophy and I give the statement, you cannot cross the same river twice. Some of the concerned students ask me time and again that if everything is changing, whether the statement everything is changing is also changing or not. And then I have to focus on the distinction between the first order and the second order inquiry. I would respond by saying that no, this statement won't change. This is an eternal fact that quote unquote everything is changing. Why so? Because once the statement is given, it is about the first order inquiry. It is talking about the nature of the cosmos as presented by Heraclitus. But this particular statement which functions as the principle, the proposition or the theory saying that everything is changing is not a first order inquiry, but a second order inquiry. So this rule would not apply on itself. So that is the distinction which is supposed to be understood if we intend to do philosophy. Now, since words of logical appraisal are used for talking about statements, the statements we make in using such words must at least be of the second order nature. We shall say that such words constitute a part of philosopher's second order vocabulary. Later, we shall speak analogously of first order sentences, that is, sentences used for making statements not about sentences or statements, but about objects. And second order sentences, that is, those sentences used for making statements about the first order sentences or the first order statements. So the argument goes like this in the simplest possible manner. There are any number of first order activities and disciplines such as making sample survey, questionnaire, interviews, collecting data as we do in sociology, doing lab dissections and experiments as we do in biology or chemistry, mapping the grounds as in geography, even the activities like fishing, kicking a football, stamp collecting, farming, or shipbuilding. Now, all of these are first order activities because they act on the objects of the external world. These are all first order activities because they are geared to fairly specific ends, deal in collection of particular facts, and prescribe certain sort of practices in the external world. They all manifest themselves as they adopt specialist terms, construct and follow certain procedures and rules which are publicly agreed and practiced by all. So this is the first order activity. On the whole, we know exactly what we are doing when we let ourselves in for a Friday afternoon's fishing. We know the kind of equipments that will be required and the ways of handling that equipment and so on and so forth. Now, much of what is needed to be known can be taught in a fairly pragmatic and straightforward manner. Although to achieve deep enjoyment, to possess real skill and judgment, and to gain personal success, many years must be devoted to constant practice and correction of the activity. The same is largely true of the other activities mentioned, although one might wish to object to the inclusion of specifically theoretical and practical disciplines such as zoology or zoology. But it could be argued that, quote unquote, all these are first order activities without in any way suggesting a diminution of their intellectual status. Now, this can't be true for philosophy. Why so? The problem here is, number one, philosophy has no obvious content of its own. And if there is a content, it keeps on changing from time to time and from context to context. Number two, no clearly discernible aim which governs its course. And number three, nor seemingly any identifiable reason why anyone should wish to pursue it. So the content and the form of philosophy is quite dicey in nature. I consider it as an advantage, not a disadvantage. There are no empirically based fact-finding missions which it must support and no set routines for teaching nor learning, as one is never quite sure at the outset if there is anything either to teach or to learn. So, one way in which it gains some resemblance of purpose is to look around for the first order activities and practices on which to fix its questioning gaze. The purpose then becomes second order in nature. To subject to rigorous scrutiny all of the concepts and terms, practices, rules, and regulations by which other first order activity and practices are being governed. So philosophy acts as the second order inquiry. Philosophy, as we see, is wholly uncommitted to and unconcerned with the first order activity under inspection. Instead, it is simply concerned to try to understand and make sense of that first order activity. It is concerned in as disinterested or neutral way as possible, without biases, without prejudices, with what it is that is going on under the umbrella term of maybe fishing or kicking a football. So the typical analytical tradition's assumption is that philosophy as a second order inquiry can provide the general idea or the distinct method by which all other first order disciplines and activities can get clear, can get refined about themselves, their behaviors, beliefs, and identities. So, as again Strawson says, a philosopher is concerned with form, formula, and system making, just like it happens in the field of algebra or geometry. And that is the reason why thinkers like Plato considered geometry as the original mathematics and physics as the original science. Now, since all of this discussion has gone through, let us come back to our very first question given on the very first slide, which we suspended for the time being, because this question could not have been answered unless and until we go through this entire discussion we have gone through in the last 19 slides. So on the last slide, I'm coming back to the very first question: what is this? And probably here your response was, this is a mouse. So now a philosopher doing a second order inquiry would say, and this is interesting, this might make you laugh, but this is heavy. So an analytical traditions follower, a philosopher would say, well, how can you call it a mouse? This is not a mouse. This is a picture of the mouse. This is mouseness at its best. We can call it the term mouse. This represents the concept of mouse. And by looking at this picture, which is of course general in nature, you can identify any mouse because that comes under the broad umbrella term of mouseness as is represented in this picture. So this is not a mouse, but a philosopher would say this is merely a picture of the mouse. The mouse in the sense of a general idea, a concept, a definition with the help of which maybe later, if and when we try to do a first order activity, then we would be able to, we might identify, we might recognize, or we might know a mouse. So there is a difference between the mouse, which represents the concept of mouse, and then now a mouse, which represents an individual particular entity known as mouse. So a philosopher would talk about mouseness, the definition of mouse, the notion or the concept of mouse, not any individual mouse per se. And that is the task of a philosopher. So that is why I would at the end try to justify the definition as given by Bertrand Russell once he says philosophy is nothing else but the conceptual analysis of the term. And the term here denotes this picture of the mouse. So that was all I had to present today. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you.
Audible, sir.
Yes, sir.
Very much audible. Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Rao. And I must congratulate Prashant ji for his very, very forceful argumentation in favor of analytical school of philosophy, which he and his colleagues are doing in Lucknow University. We call it Analytical School of Lucknow. So we argue, we have argued previously also, personally also, but in his presentation today, what I find lacking is the due respect for literary criticism, because the literary criticism was not given a full understanding what does it mean. Another question which came to my mind is that does or making such a distinction, do you mean to say that continental tradition of philosophy belongs to literary criticism type of thinking? Because this sort of obvious conclusion is coming from your presentation. Because now the difficulties arise. When we say that it is a second order conceptual analysis, can we say the continental philosophers are not doing the conceptual analysis? I would like to just take two examples. One which is very dear to you and to me as well, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell as well as Jean-Paul Sartre, they both indulge in a very, very serious conceptual analysis in their own way. But they also indulge in lot of socio-political thinking, including abstraction as well as activism. How can we make a demarcation in their lives that when they were acting or they were thinking about the political and social philosophy, its concepts, as well as acting as activists, they were not acting as philosophers. So I think the whole conception of philosophy in analytical school, no doubt it has got its own contribution. But what we always say, clarity is not enough. Clarity is required in every sphere, but it is not enough. It is too thin a conception of philosophy, and it leads us to nowhere. And that's why there is a problem with students who come to philosophy with lot of expectation, and when they meet such type of conceptual analysis leading nowhere, they leave philosophy in disgust. So I think this whole idea of that philosophy is a second order activity, and it has got nothing to do with ethics, aesthetics, and goodness, and all that emancipation, all these liberation of humans is somewhat too limiting a way of looking at philosophy. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, yes, you are very much clear in your position, but there is a gap. The gap is between the technical philosophy and the activism. And the gap is to be filled by somewhat we can say ethical, social, and political philosophy, to which analytical philosophers are found deficient. And Russell, you wrongly quoted in the beginning that Sartre was talking about unpopular lectures. Actually, the book is Unpopular Essays by Russell. So you corrected later on, but he never said that what he is doing is unpopular essays. He was doing his activism according to his own political philosophy and beliefs. So this was rather an extension of his role as a philosopher. It is there is no break which analytical philosophers think about in the role of philosopher as an analytical philosophy, as a technical philosopher, and a social activist. This is what I want to respond. Thank you very much, and congratulations for a very clear presentation of your position.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Uh, I just quote uh, counter to your assessment and argument the famous Marx saying that philosophers hitherto have tried to understand the world. The point, however, is to change it. And he tried her whole of his life to understand the social world and to change it. So this discussion and this controversy will continue. Now not. However, the point is to change it. So the understanding is never denied, but limiting oneself to the understanding only leaves behind the major purpose of changing the world. So this is where you give emphasis. That is the point. Okay, thank you very much. We will continue discussing as we always do in Lucknow. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tandon and Dr. Sukla. Well, let us move to Dr. Ranjit Ghosh, sir. Sir, welcome, sir. Sir, Dr. Ghosh, please, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your remark. I appreciate it. In the last portion of Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, once Wittgenstein says the task of a philosopher is to show the fly out of the fly bottle. So, by developing a clearer understanding, of course, there is continental inclination at the end, and that is why we distinguish between TLP and PI, of course, later on. So, yes, a philosopher shows the way out, but how? Not by activism, but by developing a clearer understanding of knowledge. So, I would agree on this point with you, sir. Thank you, with due respect, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sukla. Well, and thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for raising this question. Well, we have with us professors. Dr. Tiwari, Anil Tiwari, sir, would you like to um, 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 uh, react on, respond to what Dr. Sukla talked of? Dr. Tiwari, yes, welcome, sir. Thank you, Dr. Tiwari, for your observations. I too feel that using the word judgment for philosophy would be very harsh. Well, philosophers have a convincing. They have to a sort of what you said. Philosophy, whatever you assert, that should be of a convincing nature. Rather, it should not be. We should not use the word judgment, because that would be a sort of final, say, I think, a sort of finality to something. You are giving a sort of finality to something. So that sort of thing, well, it doesn't occur in philosophy. So in philosophy, what we try to see is need to assert something that is convincing to others. So that would be a better position that we can take. Thank you, Dr. Tiwari, for suggesting this. Thank you. Well, we have with us, well, there is a question in the chat box by Smriti Rekha.
Dr. Rao, 1 minute.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
In this connection, I would like to say, I also appreciate Professor Tiwari saying this. I also believe that there is no finality to philosophical conclusions. But it also reminds us, so this is also a piece of judgment. That is what I want to say. Because you see, what Bradley has said long back, that if you want to reject philosophy, then the choice is not between philosophy and no philosophy. Now, thing is, a person who denies philosophy is a brother philosopher with a rival theory of his own. So, if we have to accept this position, then we know that there is no finality to philosophical conclusions. But whatever it may be, it is a piece of judgment. That is what I want to add. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay. So, taking both the positions, Dr. Tiwari and Dr. Ghosh, what Dr. Ghosh tries to say is, when he talks of judgment, well, he has in mind that it is not the final word on the subject. Well, there is even the philosopher knows there are rival things to what he asserts. So that acceptance has in the mind of a philosopher, and that's how even the philosopher understands. Even when you talk, when you say, when you give an assertion, a sort of judgment, it's not a final judgment, it's not a final word on the subject. If that is the position, we can go with Dr. Tiwari and Dr. Ranjit Ghosh together. There is no problem. Okay, so finally, it should be something which is convincing. That is the real task of a philosopher. The assertion that should have a convincing role on the opponent. Okay, thank you. Well, there is a question in the chat box by Smriti Rekha Nayak. She says, well, I think it would be a nice question. Well, I don't know how to take this. What would be the criteria for a true philosophy? What do you think is philosophy in itself? So, two questions by Smriti Rekha Naik. She is a PG student in Odisha. Well, she had a question. What would be a criteria for a true philosophy? And the next question, Siraj, is what do you think is philosophy in itself? Okay, Dr. Sukla. Dr. Sukla. Thank you, sir. Well, one thing.
So, since Prashantji has named me, I would like to bring to his notice the shlok of Mahabharata, where Duryodhan says that, Hey Parth, I know what is good and what is bad, but I have no inclination for that. So I think this problem of acrasia and all that, that has also to be looked into. Why to distinguish between good and bad when there is no possibility of making human persons good? This is the problem. Seeing the world today, how can we say that that is the generalization and this is the just some sort of exception? Okay.
The Shrutireka referred to Nietzsche, the perspectivistic position. So we have to accept a perspective. So that is why she was probably referring to Nietzsche in this connection. Thank you.
I can't hear you. Am I audible? Please raise your hand if if I am audible. Thank you. There is some problem in my laptop. I can't hear um, through this laptop, but I was hearing through my mobile phone. In this session, I shall go with the comment and observation of um, Dr. Tandon. Thank you so much, sir, for your beautiful observation. Conceptual analysis is one of the activities of philosophy. Philosophical activity is not confined to only conceptual analysis. That is my point, number one. Number secondly, I shall say conceptual discussion about what? There is a fact, there is a reality, fact and a concept, dichotomy between fact and concept. There is something about which there is a dispute, and for that we have an analytical discussion. What that fact is, that was tried by philosophers down the ages, right from Socrates to the modern time, and right from Vedas and Upanishads to the modern time. What exactly that fact is, that is not settled yet. But without a fact, there is no value of conceptual analysis, no need of analysis. If we insist on conceptual analysis without any findings of fact, then the satiric comments about philosophical activity, what people say, that we are searching a black cat in the dark room, that they are correct. But philosophy is not that. I appreciate the comment of Dr. Tandon, sir, when he said that such type of philosophical definition and description will discourage students to take part in philosophical activity, philosophical career in philosophy, uh, which is not true in itself. Philosophy is not exactly that, but it is a very, because when we are speaking philosophically, naturally we are speaking logically. Okay, and I shall go with the comment of our Dr. Ghosh. He said that criticism is the common factor in both literary criticism and logical criticism. That part is philosophy. Whether you do that in literature or in literally or logically, thinking critical thinking is philosophy. We can say it in better way. But if we are analyzing for nothing, then it is mere analysis. And if we are doing that down the centuries, then we are doing nothing. Thirdly, I shall say there is no conclusion in philosophy. That is also true. But unfortunately, philosophers have concluded themselves. Plato, when we say Plato's philosophy, that means Plato is a conclusion. Aristotelian philosophy means Aristotle is a conclusion. Kantian philosophy means when we say somebody's philosophy, it appears that he has a judgment and he has a philosophical conclusion. Okay, therefore we compare between this philosophy with that philosophy or this philosopher with that philosopher, and we are doing that in the classroom, and we claim that that is the real charm of philosophy. By discussing the philosophy of others, and we jump from one philosophy to another philosophy. But when existentialist philosophers, they claim about the very practical aspect of human existence, they are not doing conceptual analysis. I am giving the example of existentialist philosophers from the Western land. If I shall give example from the Indian perspective, then this is not philosophy, this is darshan, and its role is something different. It is not conceptual, mere conceptual analysis. But even from the perspective of a Western land, Western philosophy, when we are studying the philosophy of existentialism, they are against the essentialism. They are against conceptualism. They are very much concerned about the practical human individualistic existence. So that is factual. Now, and the last point I shall say, philosophy is not deviated from values. If any study is not factual, if it is not factual oriented, then it cannot entertain any value. Mere conceptual analysis does not inspire any value philosophy, any value education. Value comes when we land and live in facts. So we cannot distinguish philosophy from ethics or the study of values. Automatically it can be done if we shall confine philosophy to only logical analysis or conceptual analysis. Philosophy has become confined to logical analysis in the modern trend. We may take the example, the names of Bertrand Russell, and these are all modern thinkers. But when fact is concerned, human life is concerned, if a philosophy subject has any value in itself, then that is transformation of human life. If by studying philosophy we are not getting transformed, then conceptual understanding by conceptual judgment or conceptual discussion, conceptual analysis yielding to nothing has no value, because we have to reach at a point that may not be conclusion, but automatically, because there should be a starting point, that is fact, That should be the ending point, that is the fact, and the bridge is philosophical analysis. Because there is something about which I am analyzing, and I have to reach somewhere. I have to reach somewhere. That reaching point may not be the conclusion for all. That does not matter. But individually, I have to reach at a point. Therefore, Plato reached at his point, Aristotle reached at his point, many great philosophers, they have reached at a point. That may be criticized by other philosophers, and that is the natural process. So this is my submission, and I need answer from Dr. Sukla. This is also my question. Thank you.
Sir, I totally agree with you up to the point. I got confused at one of the point where you said that your sense was that it should have applicability. I mean, the task of philosophy. And then you took it to the broader sense, and my only fear of taking it in the broader sense is that as broader we make it, so much chances of ambiguity we put inside it. Is it not the case?
I could not
Not get you. Please repeat.
Sir, I simply intended to say that I totally agree with your definition, but the thing is that as broader or general you make the definition of any discipline, you provide space for ambiguity to seep in. And that is the risk which is most prevalent in the field of philosophy. And that is why there are a lot of people who try to do religion, who try to do spiritualism, who try to do activism on the brand name of philosophy. Do you think it's a good idea, or it should
No,
be persuaded further?
I don't think so. I don't think so because the philosophical analysis ends at clarity. We should reach at clarity. But do you really reach at the clarity or it continues? Because everybody has decided to disagree with the previous philosopher. Where you get the clarity? Was Aristotle clear about Plato? Was any philosopher who is clear about the previous philosopher? No, he has his own philosophy. He is trying to develop a new trend. So, do you think that philosophy is an abstract study having no relevance with the practical life of human life? If it is so, it may be philosophy, but that is not darshan what we study in Indian context. That is not philosophy in Indian context. It may be philosophy in the Western perspective. This is my observation because having any type of study, forget philosophy. Suppose you are reading economics, suppose you are reading sociology. If high at all we need education because we are human beings, we our sole goal is to transform what I was yesterday. I should have a better version today. But if philosophy is only thrown to the dustbin of conceptual analysis for nothing, then this purpose is not fulfilled. Perhaps I may not express my thought, but it was very well. It was it was very well expressed by Dr. Tandon, sir. Perhaps I failed to express my thought, but I. Yes.
Thank you, Saurabh, for this wonderful question. As far as my understanding and training goes, yes, Shabd depicts a literary position, but the adding of the suffix praman makes it a kind of logical criticism as well. Because yes, Shabd, whether it is Vedic or Maukik, in both the cases it becomes the subject matter of literary concern. But then you cannot forget the term Pramana. Pramana is something which requires consistency of the argument. So to call it as a purely literary criticism, I would hold my hands back. But yes, Anuman is a purely logical criticism, and I do agree with that. Thank you, Saurav. I appreciate that. Yes, Javed ji from Kashmir. I'm so happy to get this question. And yes, logical philosophers are concerned with rediscovering, clarifying, refining what is written, what is spoken in any format, whatever. And literary criticism requires its moral seriousness in the sense of its applicability. I would reassert that nobody is denying the value of literary criticism. It is as important as logical criticism. What I wanted to emphasize in this 1 hour discussion was that they can be complementary, they are complementary. Simply that they are not one and the same thing. Otherwise, I totally agree with what you assert here. Thank you, Saurabh ji. Thank you, Javed ji. But Professor Rao, why it cannot be speculative? Of course, it can be speculative. It can be. The only thing is that the point of applicability or practicality, which has been emphasized so much by Dr. Tandon and Dr. Das, which I do not disagree with, is of course a part of any knowledge process. In fact, that's the famous statement which says knowledge is a growing phenomena. We are moving from less perfect knowledge to more perfect knowledge with the search for absolutely perfect knowledge, which is like a mirage. So yes, we are refining the knowledge for the sake of its applicability. Why I am searching for the meaning of good? Of course, so that I can become good. What I simply want to establish here is that there is a limit to every discipline. It would be too egoistic a claim on my part to say that philosophy can do each and everything under the sun. I would call it a kind of solipsism. Philosophy does a very important task, and so does other discipline. But then they are not one and the same. They are supporting, they are assisting, and they are complementing each other. That's how I read the discipline, but then it is one of the way of reading the thing. People can disagree with me or refine my understanding as well. Thank you, Rao sir.
One thing, Dr. Rao, the question of Sabda Pramana when it came. Now, Sabda Pramana is getting its authenticity. It is a type of tautological statement, we should say, that and they cannot be put into any criticism because as the Sabda Pramana that is coming in now, it is taken to be true by itself. It is tautological in nature. So, but Anumana and others are not. They can be taken as logical, put into the logical test. But Sabda Pramana cannot be put into logical test. This is what is coming to my mind. I'm not sure. So we have to think over it. Thank you.
True, sir. That was my intention when I said that every shabd cannot become pramana. So, yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I totally agree with you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We are all grateful to Dr. Sukla for his wonderful presentation, and we shall invite him again and again with a beautiful topic. And he has also keen interest to deliver talks in this forum. And that matters. Thank you, sir. With this session is declared closed. Thank you. Thank you, all.